Welcome everyone, and this is the second masterclass in a series of masterclasses that Warchild Holland will be running. The initiative came from the Research and Development Department. The idea with these masterclasses is to select different kinds of themes that have a lot of relevance to our work at Warchild Holland and to the fields in which we work in general. So the topic for today is fostering resilience in aid workers, and with a particular focus on the potential of mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches. But I'm sure you all already know that. And you've probably also seen the overview of this afternoon, but I'll give a brief introduction of about 15 minutes. Kenneth Pakenham from Australia, he's come all the way from Australia to speak to us about his work. Then we have two people doing reflection, actually three. So we will have Mirna Kassa from the Warchild Lebanon office talking about what her work at Warchild is about. And then we also have Eric Flopper and Winifred Simon from Antares Foundation, who will also talk about how they work with Warchild and how they work with other organisations. Eamon will lead a discussion. We have about half an hour for discussion. And then, it's not up here, but we also have drinks afterwards. So please make sure you stay around for drinks and further informal discussion. I think that's often the most valuable part. Sound right? Okay. Our speakers will talk a lot more about this, I'm sure. But these are just some figures to get us sort of into the headspace about what we're talking about when we're talking about resilience of aid workers. So these figures come from a study that was actually done by Antares Foundation and the CDC, just showing high rates of things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, emotional exhaustion, and a lack of personal satisfaction amongst both expatriate aid workers, so people that are moving from their home country to another context, but also national aid workers. So these rates are very high compared to the normal population average. So why is this? This slide is not based on scientific evidence. This is my thoughts, just to make that clear. But if we think about it, if you're living away from home in a difficult context, you face the usual work stress that everyone faces within their work. Often in the kinds of roles that people are in, their work might be quite new and challenging. It's a different thing to what they've been doing previously often, which is an extra kind of weight. Add to that the unsafe context in which people are often working in, and the daily stresses and the challenges that can come with that. The low resources that we often face in the field, in the places that we're working, both human resources and also financial and other resources, electricity, internet, so on. Sometimes people might have experienced traumatic events themselves. They're also hearing stories of the people that they're working with about the traumatic experiences they have been through. Add to this, they're away from their loved ones, and they're away from their usual coping strategies, out of their normal routine, not able to access those things that usually help them to manage stress. So these are some of the stresses that people might be facing. So this is the topic of today's talk, and I just wanted to give an introduction to Ken, who, like I said, is come from Australia. He's from the University of Queensland. And when I first met Ken, it was during my clinical psychology training, when I was training to be a psychologist. And he was a professor teaching us different types of therapy and all about mental health disorders and so on. But the way that I got to know him better was he was conducting some research into the work stress and just general mental health of clinical psychology trainees. So not the people that we're working with, but our own mental health. And he found that it was not so good. There were like high rates of stress, high rates of depression, high rates of anxiety. And so he decided that, well, actually, the university needed to offer us something for ourselves. So he and a more senior doctorate student ran a course for us for us to think about our own mental health. So they already anticipated that we would have our notebooks out, we would be taking notes about how we could use this for our clients. But they made it very clear, like, put your notebooks away. This is firstly for you. It's for your own stress, not for the people that you work with. But keeping in mind that we needed to look after ourselves in order to do that most effectively. And one of the things that, one of the metaphors that I took away and still think of when I think of that course was that first we need to sharpen the axe. So this is kind of relating to, we wouldn't go and try and chop down trees with a rusty axe. We would we would spend the time to sharpen our tool first. And if we're thinking about people in the helping profession, your tool that you're using to do your job is yourself, and your ability to sit with people and to hear their stories and to hold some of their pain and to listen and be present. And in order to be able to do that most effectively, you need to really look after yourself first. So in that sense, it really kind of gave me a lot of, it allowed me to give myself permission to take that time to look after myself. And yeah, that stuck with me for a long time. So to give you a bit of a taste of acceptance and mindfulness techniques that I learned in the course and then also used like when I was working with clients as well, and Ken's going to talk a lot more about that. It's easiest just to do it with a little bit of an exercise first, and we're going to look at thoughts. So I'd like you to all take part if you're willing, and your job is really easy. You just have to follow my instruction. So I'm going to give you an instruction, I'm going to count to 3, and then you just have to do it. Easy, right? So your instruction is, do not think of a pink elephant. Okay? Easy, right? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Who was able to follow the instruction? Really? Okay. But here's the catch. When I asked you who was able to think of the instruction, you had to think back to the instruction, which included pink elephants. So, in reality, yeah, it's very hard for us to control our thoughts. I hope everyone would agree with that. So, yeah, but it is our natural kind of response to feel like we can control our thoughts, we can follow that instruction. We don't want to think of a pink elephant, I just might think of a pink elephant. It's not really that simple. Yeah. So that's a silly thought, doesn't really cause too many emotions in us besides maybe we smile. But what about if the thoughts that we're trying to not think about, trying to push away, trying to suppress, are a little bit more sinister? So our minds are really good, especially when we're under stress, at giving us more difficult thoughts. Whatever I do, nothing actually improves. I don't know what I'm doing. Everyone else seems much stronger and can handle the stress better. There must be something wrong with me. I'm weak. So when we are faced with thoughts like these, often what we try and apply to this is, well, just don't think about it, push it away. It should be easy, just follow the instruction. But as you saw with the pink elephant example, it's not so easy. And like I said, there'll be a lot more talk about these kind of techniques, but I'm just going to show a short video to get things started. The video is going to be talking about anxiety, but we can basically apply this to anxiety, stress, fear, sadness, guilt, whatever it might be.
It often seems like we've got a struggle switch at the back of our mind. And as soon as an uncomfortable emotion, a painful feeling or memory shows up, it's like the struggle switch goes on and we start to struggle with it. So let's suppose anxiety shows up. A very common, painful emotion that we all get to experience. Anxiety shows up, the struggle switch goes on. Oh, there's anxiety, I don't like anxiety, I want to get rid of my anxiety. Now I've got anxiety about my anxiety. So it's getting bigger. With the struggle switch on, I now get, oh, my anxiety's getting bigger. How do I get rid of my anxiety? Now I've got even more anxiety. With the struggle switch on, I may then get angry about my anxiety. Why is this anxiety keep showing up? I hate this anxiety. Then I might even start to feel sad about my anger. Oh, is this my life? Oh, and then I may start to feel guilty about my sadness about my anger. Oh, how pathetic am I with the starving kids in Africa? So if my struggle switch on, my emotions get amplified. I've now got guilt about my sadness, about my anger, about my anxiety, about my anxiety. And that kind of amplification of emotions gives them more impact and influence over my life and often gets me bogged down, pulls me into self-defeating behaviors. Now, what happens if I can switch off the struggle switch? With the struggle switch off, anxiety shows up, and it's not that I like it or want it or approve of it, it's just I'm not going to struggle with it. I'm not going to invest my time, energy, and effort in struggling with this anxiety. Instead, I'm going to invest it in doing meaningful, life-enhancing activities, such as spending quality time with my friends and family, playing with my kids. Now, with the struggle switch off, the anxiety is free to move. It may get higher, it may get lower, it may move quickly, it may move slowly, but the point is it's free to move. It doesn't get amplified by all of these other emotions which make it kind of bigger and stickier and make it hang around for a lot longer. So there's no such thing as a life without anxiety. It shows up for all of us. But when anxiety shows up and the struggle switch is off, it's so much easier to live with than when the struggle switch is on.
Okay, so I've been working hard on having my struggle switch off when I was facing the anxiety of having to come up and talk to you all and talk with being filmed. So I hope this has got you kind of a little bit in the mood for the rest of the discussion. Just a brief note about where we are using these kinds of approaches in Warchild. So I know that you can't see a lot of the text on this slide, but we have more information, handouts just over by the door. This is our Warchild Holland care system that we're working towards. So we're working on developing and evaluating 9 core interventions that would be delivered in all the settings in which we work if there's no other local alternative available. These are across education, child protection, and psychosocial and mental health sectors. So with the acceptance and commitment, or acceptance and mindfulness approaches, we are incorporating that into some of our work with caregivers, particularly the stress that they might face around parenting. And we're also working on a family intervention with some different components. It might address parents' mental health, their parenting, and also their couple relationship. And we also plan to use these kinds of evidence-based approaches in there. But I do think that the role of this acceptance and mindfulness approach and boosting mental health and boosting resilience does play a huge role in the people that are going to be implementing our care system, and that's part of the reason for the topic today. So we're asking people in the countries in which we work to work with families, work with children experiencing a lot of difficulties, a lot of painful experiences, a lot of challenges, and a lot of traumatic events. And we need to, as an organisation, I think, make sure that we have systems in place, policies in place, and programs in place that can really support those people to work most effectively with the people that they're working with, and also to look after themselves so that we can maintain their well-being for one, retain them in the workforce and keep them on board, and yeah, have them do the best job that they can with the people that we're working with. So, I'll now switch over to Ken. Ken would like to invite you, if there's a pressing question about some of the content he's talking about, do feel free to ask your question, to kind of raise your hand, and someone will come around with the microphone. But otherwise, we do have half an hour for discussion at the end if you wanted to wait and see if maybe some of the other, it might be covered in some of the other reflection as well.
So, thank you for coming and listening to me. I am happy to be here in Amsterdam with your blue sky and nice weather. It's like our winter weather in Brisbane, where I come from. And so I will start because we're on a tight schedule. And this is Brisbane, which is subtropical. And it is a river city, and so I hope you will visit sometime at the other end of the earth. So Auckland is actually where I originally come from, Auckland in New Zealand. So today we're going to cover the research on aid worker mental health. That is my PhD student's research, Tali Young. So I really want to emphasise that this is her research under my supervision. Tali actually worked as a humanitarian aid worker for several years prior to undertaking her PhD. So she has work as well as professional interests in this field. The segments of her research that I'm going to talk about, so you know where we're going to go to. First of all, we're going to look at the qualitative data on aid worker stressors and coping strategies. Then we'll move to describing levels of mental health in aid workers, and then explore associations between aid worker mental health, socio-demographics, and aid contexts, variables. And then we will look at psychological protective factors for aid workers. And then finally talk to you about an intervention for promoting mental health among aid workers, an intervention that draws on the strategies that Felicity introduced: mindfulness, acceptance, and values-based behaviour change strategies. So here we go. So we already know, Felicity's clarified, and there'll be no surprise here, that aid workers are at increased risk for these various forms of psychological distress. Complicating factors are stigma around seeking support for psychological distress. And this is common among people that work in a helping way with other people. It's sort of like you've been trained to help and you are working in a healing, helping role. So in a way, it doesn't look good for me to have depression or anxiety or experience mental health problems. So there's a stigma around that. And of course, there are support issues that Felicity also mentioned. And in general, the focus has been on aid worker mental health problems and quality of life, fullness of life is not about the absence of mental health difficulties. It's not about the absence of sadness, anxiety or stress, because they're actually natural, wholesome, healthy parts of being human and living. So there's another aspect to mental health, and that is well-being, thriving and living fully. And so our research would like to explore that as well. So here we go. I'm going to talk about the method of the overall initial study. So we used an online survey that took about 20 minutes. It was in English. It had quantitative and qualitative measures. About 400 aid workers logged in, but of those, 386 were really eligible to participate. We included overlooked groups like development aid workers and national aid workers. The mean age was 36, most were female. Interestingly, they lived across 77 different countries, and we had 59 nationalities represented, so quite a broad cross-section. Our quantitative measures assessed well-being, distress, burnout, psychological flexibility, resilience, and meaning. We had 9 demographics that we measured, and importantly, quite comprehensively, 13 aid context variables. So, to the first matter, aid workers' views on stresses and coping. So to our knowledge, there is no published research where researchers have asked aid workers what their stresses are and what coping strategies they use to manage. So we included qualitative questions about these issues, and I'm going to report on this data. There were 4 overarching themes that emerged through content analyses: work, psychological, lifestyle, and social connection. So stresses and coping strategies both fitted under these 4 overarching themes. So the most frequently mentioned stressor fell under the work theme, and the 3 major sub-themes were working with others, organisational, and working conditions, and they're in order of frequency of reporting. There are further detailed codes within each of those sub-themes, and I'm not going to give you that level of detail because it's too much. This is the nature of qualitative data, so I'm giving you a more summary form. The next most frequently mentioned theme came under psychological. The suffering of others and unfair systems were the 2 sub-themes. Then lifestyle, physical health and safety, and living conditions. And in respect to social connections, it was about difficulties in managing personal relationships. So here we have, at a very broad level, the major stressor themes. Big enough. All right. I just don't like hearing my own voice. I can sort of hear it really loud. Lifestyle. So now let's turn to effective coping. So they were asked to identify effective and ineffective coping strategies. Effective coping strategies, again, fell under the 4 overarching themes. In relation to lifestyle-related coping strategies were the most frequently mentioned. And the major sub-theme here was self-care, activities like exercise, hobbies, having holidays. The next most frequent theme fell under social connection with support from others. And then psychological with 2 sub-themes: mental self-care like meditation, spiritual practices, therapy. And then cognitive reappraisal was the next sub-theme, using humour, acceptance, getting perspective. Work was also mentioned, and 2 sub-themes: personal work strategies like working less or using more effective work habits, and then work conditions, in some way changing the work condition context. So these were the major effective coping strategy themes. In terms of ineffective coping, like effective coping, the most frequently mentioned ineffective coping strategies fell under lifestyle. Unhealthy activities, and we're all familiar with these, where we drink too much, we have poor diet, we stay sedentary, and we smoke and do other things. The next is working longer hours, engaging in procrastination. Social connection, the major sub-themes of ineffective coping, isolation, complaining, gossiping, and then finally psychological, using avoidance, venting, and engaging in worry. So these were the ineffective coping strategies. Now at the end I'm going to come back to these because we were able to map the ineffective and effective coping strategies on the psychological flexibility model that embraces acceptance and mindfulness strategies. So I'll come back to these later. So we also compared national and international workers on the qualitative data on all of these themes. So compared to national workers, internationals more frequently reported stresses around working with others, working conditions, and physical health and safety. In terms of coping strategies, the internationals were more likely to report helping activities and self-care, support from others, but all of the ineffective coping strategies as well. So we compared the development and humanitarian aid workers, primarily because from our reading of the literature, development aid workers are often excluded from aid work research, and yet they play a very important role. So compared to development workers, humanitarian workers more frequently reported organisational problems and unhealthy activities as ineffective coping strategies. They were the only differences there. We also compared males and females on qualitative data. Female workers were more frequently reported living condition stresses and unhealthy activities in relation to coping strategies. Male workers were more frequently reported coping strategies in relation to work, and they were specifically personal organisation and working with others. So gender differences. So the qualitative findings of interest by way of a summary now. Some coping strategies identified were identified as both effective and ineffective. So alcohol would be used as an effective coping strategy, and sometimes it would be used and identified as an ineffective coping strategy. Working less versus working more could also be used as one or the other. And so this fits with stress and coping theory, which is a theoretical framework that I spent the first 15 years of my academic career working in terms of a theoretical model, looking at clinical applications of this model, and consistent with stress and coping, and consistent with the psychological flexibility framework that encompasses mindfulness and acceptance processes. A coping strategy cannot be, in an absolute sense, good or bad, effective or ineffective, maladaptive or adaptive, because it depends on the actual context in which the coping strategy is used and on the outcomes. So this is an interesting finding that was also supported by the qualitative data. The extensive range of coping strategies was of interest, given that most of the research on coping among aid workers uses predefined checklists of coping strategies. There were well over 60 coping codes that were developed. Interestingly, there were 13 psychological coping mechanisms, and yet psychological coping does not appear to be a major focus of many aid organisations. Working with others was the most frequent sub-theme in sub-theme stressor in the work domain. Remember, the work domain was the major and most frequently mentioned stressor domain. Yet it is often neglected in aid organisations. So for many aid workers, it was the interpersonal work context that they found most difficult. Things like levels of manager competence, conflict amongst working teams, lack of trust in colleagues, disorganised processes, etc. There are many specific codes that come under that. I won't go through them all, but we thought that that was an interesting finding on the background of the broader research in this area. So related to that was the evidence that most of the stressors that the aid workers mentioned had origins from within the aid organisation, not externally. And our sense of the commentary and research in the area is that a lot of emphasis is on the external conditions, which are much more dramatic and much more visible and much more knowable than perhaps some of the internal stresses that occur within aid organisations. We thought that was an interesting finding. Another interesting finding from the qualitative data was that trauma was only mentioned 8 times out of the almost 300 respondents. Yet, and I now turn to the quantitative data, but just to give a context in which to understand that qualitative, in a sense, omission, 49% of the respondents reported one or more traumas related to work. So almost half the sample identified traumatic events, but none of them, interestingly, mentioned it spontaneously in terms of it being salient and something that they wanted to mention as a significant difficulty. Of the 49% that reported traumas, 26% were from outside. There's of course possible overlap between those. You could have trauma from outside plus from inside work and outside work. 26 had nil trauma. So going to the quantitative data again, the number of traumatic events or years since last traumatic event were unrelated to mental health. So that was a really interesting finding, that anxiety, stress, depression, well-being and burnout, or the burnout scars, were unrelated to number of traumatic events and length of time since traumatic event. However, there was one exception. Number of traumatic events was correlated with positive achievement, which is one of the burnout subscales. So more events, lower personal achievement. So this qualitative data and quantitative data around trauma was interesting. Okay, so let's now move to descriptive data on levels of mental health in aid workers. And we use the dual factor model of mental health. The absence of mental disorders is not an adequate definition of mental health. You can have an absence of mental disorders but have very, very low life satisfaction and meaning in life. So we looked at both well-being and the presence or absence of distress. So this is not surprising. Now, the dark blue is aid worker, the light blue is the comparative group or the normative data. So no surprises here, the aid workers were significantly more distressed on each of the dimensions compared to normative data. In terms of well-being, this is the data that hasn't been published in other studies. Aid workers also reported significantly lower well-being on each of the 3 subscales there compared to normative data. And with burnout, they report significantly higher burnout on 2 of the subscales, excluding depersonalisation. So that's the well-being, which is really probably what's new. The other data of the presence of distress pretty much mirrors what exists in the literature, but it's important to show that aid workers as a whole, on average, also are reporting lower well-being. In terms of clinically significant distress, 24% scored within the severe to extremely severe levels on 1 of the 3 subscales. In terms of well-being, 7% were languishing, only a small number, but interestingly, of the 7%, only some of them, a small number, reported clinically significant levels of distress, going to the point that you can have one without the other. In terms of burnout, high burnout was reported on all 3 subscales by 14%, and some variations across the individual subscales. So now looking at the association between mental health and demographics and aid work context. So what has been neglected in the prior literature are national aid workers, development workers, and smaller groups of employees like small NGOs, independent consultants, and private managing contractors, all of whom we captured in our sample. So I'm just going to go through this in a summary way. So the low risk demographics were being male, having a higher subjective income, stronger religious identity, spirituality, and there was one ethnicity difference. It's important to point out that these correlations are of a low magnitude, they're not very strong. And the other thing to point out, of course, these are correlations and not causation. So we know that, for example, stronger religious identity is related to higher well-being, personal accomplishment, and lower emotional exhaustion. But we can't say that stronger religious identity causes. It's simply a correlation. And as I say, the study is quite high-powered because of the large sample size, so even small associations become significant. So continuing with the low-risk demographic factors, more years worked, and being in a non-disaster context, and being a national worker were also all associated with better mental health outcomes. Interestingly, there were non-significant associations for short-term versus long-term consultant arrangements, organisational type, and humanitarian versus development professionals. So the other thing we were interested in is psychological protective factors. The published research on sort of resources, assets, or protective factors have focused primarily on organisational related factors. And we were interested in psychological factors that were related to better mental health. So we have aid worker mental health, and we were interested in resilience, psychological flexibility, and meaning as possible psychological protective factors. Resilience, because a number of resilience-oriented interventions have been mentioned in the literature. Psychological flexibility, because it is a trans-diagnostic framework that attempts to explain generic therapeutic mental health processes, irrespective of mental health diagnosis. So it has broad reach. The model also targets known generic pathology processes, if you like, that help to cultivate mental health problems. So it has a sort of a universal application. So we're interested in psychological flexibility and meaning, because we know that many aid workers enter the field with strong ideals and a strong attachment and a sense of wanting to make a difference in the world. So the meaning inherent in this sort of work is significant. We've got our mental health outcomes and we've got our predictors, and so we control for significant demographics and aid context variables. So it's a reasonably strong regressional model in that we have a number of significant control variables, and we're asking the question, once these control variables have been put in the model, to what extent can these psychological factors explain variability in aid worker mental health? So that's broadly the model that we've used. Okay, so in terms of well-being, meaning and psychological flexibility predict well-being. For psychological distress, meaning and resilience predict psychological distress. And for burnout, meaning predicts all three, and psychological flexibility predicts personal accomplishment. So in summary, meaning is king. It was the winner. It remained a consistent predictor across all of the tests. Psychological flexibility was next, and resilience only really predicted one outcome. So, all three are important, and particularly we need to pay attention to meaning in our work and interventions with aid workers. In terms of interventions, this is what I want to turn to now. The existing response for aid workers' mental health from our reading provides independent guidelines but limited organisational support and resources. There are in-house organisational initiatives, often not based on psychological research, not tested rigorously, and often not available outside organisations. To our knowledge, there's no empirically tested psychological intervention designed for aid workers that's published and available in the literature. So this is our next step, and Tali and I, we've drafted an online mindfulness or psychological flexibility informed intervention. So the idea is that it will be web-based. There will be approximately 4 30-minute modules with experiential exercises, a little bit of information giving, homework and practice between the modules, so do a module each week. And it will be web-based. We will start in English. And we will test it in a randomised controlled trial. I will come back to the intervention because I think I am now at the end of this part of the talk. Now I would like to go to the intervention. But before I do, because I'm really doing well with my time, this is good, because we've got more time to play with the intervention. But do you have any questions about those areas that I've presented in terms of the research that we've done? Yes? Yes?
I have a question about the meaning part.
Yes.
Because I think meaning because I think meaning can be a personal element, but can also be given by the way your organization works.
Yes.
So is that taken on board within the research, or how did that go?
No, so we used a generic meaning measure, widely used. It had the two subscales, presence of meaning and search for meaning. So meaning is individually determined. I find my meaning in life. You might give me guidelines, or the organisation I work for might have values, but I find my own as well. And that's really critical. From the psychological flexibility perspective, we would say that meaning stems from being connected to your personal values, and then giving action, giving voice, giving behavioural expression to deeply felt, heartfelt values. And that brings meaning. I mean, can you imagine anything more fulfilling than knowing what your deep desires are, behaving consistently with them? You'd explode. Yes. It's powerful. It's a great motivator. So I see meaning in a practical way evolving from this magnificent combination of deep, heartfelt desires. You know, what do I want to do with my life? Why am I here? What mark do I want to make in my relationships, in my work, at play, in the community? You know, how do I want to express and live my life? And then if I actually do stuff that's, you know, physically demonstrates and expresses that heartfelt desire, that's like heaven, if there is such a place. Yes? Sorry. Yeah. Oh, are you doing this?
No, I
do
can
it.
walk further than you can.
Oh, yes, you can, I think. Thank you. Yes.
Who else?
It's here now. No, I'll bring it to you. That's okay. Thanks, Cam. Very interesting. Two quick questions. One is, and they're related, the graphs showing the difference between the 8 workers and the comparative group.
Yes.
Could you just explain what the normative data is, what do they represent?
Yes.
And related to that, the question, you're basically saying trauma wasn't mentioned very much at all.
Not the qualitative.
Exactly, and it doesn't surprise me necessarily, but then how would you explain the difference with other workforce, as it is very much there? What would you explain as the main driver for the difference then?
Okay, so good question. The trauma one is a really good question, and I'm still not really clear on it. But let me go to your first question first, which is the comparison of aid workers to normative data on each of those standardised measures. The normative samples are typically adult community members, so they're large-scale studies where they've standardised the measure and then defined the norms, large-scale community studies. Yeah.
Among a workforce, or
no, the community, the general community. Yeah. So it's the general community. Yeah, on each of those measures. And so the clinical cut-offs, for example, there's only clinical cut-offs for the distress scale. They're all based on this large large-scale population-based research of the community at large to trauma. So I don't know. Well, first of all, what the data says is people were asked what their major stresses were. And so they gave what was salient and occupying them in response to that question, and only 8 mentioned trauma. And when we look at the quantitative data, we find that the number of trauma events, so now we have 50% of the sample indicating that they've had one more traumatic event, we see no relationship between that and the outcome. So it may be that the aid organisations provide effective critical incident support and provide effective support for people who have experienced traumatic events, and that is why it's not mentioned, and that is why there's no relationship. Because you can have a traumatic event and not necessarily experience lingering trauma symptoms. I mean, there are people that, experience natural disasters, which are highly traumatic, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis in our part of the world. And not all of them have enduring traumatic symptoms. So we know from an individual perspective that we vary in terms of our resources and other attributes. So I think that it's really important to know what are the factors that protect individuals in very, very difficult times in adversity. And let's target those factors. We would suggest that meaning, psychological flexibility, and the processes within psychological flexibility are protective, and if we target them, we build resilient aid workers who are better able to withstand the tsunamis. Yeah, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think?
Well, what was the order of the questions? Could it be also that the qualitative questions were, the order of the questions, that they did not wanted to disclose it in the first part, and then when there was a quantitative question about, I don't know.
It's a good...
Because people, from themselves, they tend not to talk about trauma.
Yeah. So, well, we get 50% saying that they've experienced it, and we get 50% then responding to questions about that, like how long, what sort, etc. Almost all of those that respond to the quantitative question on trauma also respond to the open-ended questions. So the questionnaire is anonymous. There's no identifying information whatsoever. It's impossible to... it's a possibility that people they will disclose, yes, I've had trauma in a closed question, quantitative format, but they won't disclose it in a free. But I'm not sure why they would do one and not the other. I don't know. It's a possibility. But it may also be that it's not salient for them, and they just don't mention it because there are more important things, like the hassles I'm having with my colleagues. They're more immediate. They interfere with my quality of life much more than the traumatic incident I had whenever. So this mirrors actually the broader literature, not in the aid, but in the broader literature, in stress and coping literature, which shows that daily hassles, the daily hassles measure, daily hassles are more predictive of mental health outcomes than significant negative life events. So it's the chronic stresses that erode our resilience and erode our resources, perhaps more so than trauma. I would like to make a qualification here though, because we're talking about adults. So we're talking about the aid workers, we're not talking about the children, the war children who have experienced trauma. And there's a different language and a different understanding around that. Children are in the innocence and early development of their life who experience things they should never experience, things that a child should never experience, are profoundly affected by trauma because of the developmental context that they experience this in. When we talk about adults who have had a significant grounding, let's say, developed skills, they've gone through all of the busy developmental stages, they've had secure attachments and other things, generally speaking, are going to be affected by traumatic incidents in a different way than young children, beneficiaries of your work. Yes. Oh, so I have to go now, on to the other. But one more question here. Sorry. No, I've got another 10 minutes. 15 minutes. It's only half past. Oh, half past, I forgot. Yes.
No stress?
Pardon? Yes.
No stress with you, though?
Yes, question.
Yeah, question. I'm in charge of recruitment with Watch Out, and I'm looking at the results, meaning, psychological, flexibility. Are there any lessons to be taken in terms of recruitment of expatriate staff? And if so, which ones? Testing? I don't know. Can you, or is it too practical?
In terms of recruitment, yeah. Do these findings have any implications for recruitment? Look, I can't think of what implications they have for recruitment, because your question infers the possibility of selection, and I would not like to select on the basis of a person's sense of meaning and their work, nor of their psychological flexibility, nor of their resilience, because these are fluid processes that can be intervened at any time. And that's why we would like to build an intervention that provides people with the support. You know, people who believe that this work is in line with their personal values, that believe that this work will somehow cultivate the meaning that's personal to them in their life. I wouldn't want to interfere with that, but I would want to support them in offering them every possibility to give behavioural expression to the most powerful thing that they have, and the most powerful thing that aid organisations have, which are their human resources. You know, you have an empowered, passionate human being that's in contact with their personal values and wants to give physical expression. You have got dynamite.
Building on that, what about selection but allowing partners to go along with expatriates to, let's say, these kind of zones? Because we now have an exclusion criteria that certain zones you're only allowed to go along, but the support you can receive from a partner is actually quite large.
Yeah, I would think having partners would be part of the web of support mechanisms that could be made available and people utilise if they want to. Because as you saw, one of the stressors was under social connection, ARCH, and one of those was around personal relationships, and that was often in reference to the isolation of from loved ones, and then how to be negotiating the ongoing, to and fro that we have in personal relationships when one of the members is a long way away. So yes, I would think that would be a great mechanism. Can I show you something really exciting? And that is the psychological flexibility model. So this is where I just want to map the ineffective coping strategies on the psychological flexibility model, but I need to just briefly explain it. Now, it's a hexaflex, so it has 6 processes. It can be turned so that we deal with the therapeutic processes, and then we can turn it to the inverse and examine the pathology processes. So we're going to look at the pathology processes first, and these processes, according to the literature, are transdiagnostic. We know that they predict psychological problems, whether it's depression type, eating disorder type, anxiety type, whatever it is. So let's start on this side, and we go to values. And so when we're disconnected with values, we're disconnected with, in a sense, life source, life possibilities. Because without the compass and navigation of values, we dither, which leads to the next problematic process, which is behavioural inaction or ineffective behaviour. I mean, how do I make decisions? How do I have clarity about what I'm going to do if I'm not clear about my values? So, problematic. Those 2 processes are very closely aligned. So they're the very behavioural, practical part of the model. Then we got the top and the middle. And if I'm mostly in the past and mostly in the future, I am not in the present, and it is only in the present that I can take effective action based by my inner direction, my values. So being in the present moment is critical, at least a good part of the time. When you're in the present moment, you access a fundamentally powerful dimension to our humanity, our 3rd dimension. Now, this is given different names in different languages and different cultures. Spirit, soul, observer self, the silent witness, intuition, whatever you might have. It's been painted about, there's been music about it, there's been visual art, they've danced it. It is beyond language and it is beyond mental processes. It's usually accessed through practices that take us outside of mental, meditational type practices. But the observer self is in a very, very important resource and capacity that humans need to experience. And if they don't, they're working on 2 cylinders and not 6. So the next, experiential avoidance, is essentially moving away, like the struggle switch. It's about tightening up, it's about fighting against, it's about running away from discomfort, internal discomfort. Now I can drink, like some of the ineffective strategies. I might work harder and longer. There's all sorts of ways of avoiding what I experience internally through thoughts, feelings, physical sensations that I don't like. Cognitive fusion is where my attention and awareness becomes fused with mental processes, thoughts, images, memories. So when my attention gets absorbed in a thought that is unhelpful, like some of the thoughts that Felicity showed, then that's problematic. If I get absorbed in, you know, a creative idea about my writing, that can be very productive. But we know that sometimes we get lost and absorbed in thoughts that are not helpful. Okay, so then let's go to mapping. No, I'm going the wrong way. So, the experiential avoidance, ineffective strategies that aid workers spoke of, avoidance, procrastination, alcohol, drugs, using social media, can all be experiential avoidance. Cognitive fusion, worry and rumination is absorption and mental activity. Attached to conceptualized self is about complaining, often because we're attached to a concept of who we are and what our life is about. And when life doesn't meet that, we get annoyed because concepts about self are static because they're based in language and cognition. And we are in essence much more than language and cognition. Absorbed in past or present, as in worry is about absorbed in future. Crying, sad, might be rehashing past. Disconnection with values, taking on everything, poor nutrition, poor sleep. Inactivity or disorganised behaviour might be expressed through avoidance, procrastination, changing jobs, just as these were all mentioned by the aid workers. So, I now am going to finish off. So the therapeutic process is the opposite to all of these. I've sort of implied being connected to values is a positive process. Having action that is in the service of values is a positive process. Being connected to the here and now is a positive process, because when I do, I have flexible perspective taking. And that's very powerful. And then, of course, we have acceptance of my internal experiencing. And then we have cognitive diffusion, which is my capacity to go in and out of my thoughts as I so choose, in terms of being absorbed but with awareness and then coming out. So, if we look at the aid workers' effective coping strategies, they map on to the 6 processes. No, it's the wrong way. So for acceptance, we have humour, full awareness of self, cognitive diffusion, the cognitive reappraisal strategies can fit there, shift to positives can be, self as context or perspective taking, the observer self, getting perspective, seeing the bigger picture. Present moment awareness, obviously using meditation and yoga strategies. Connection with values, engaging in exercise, work-life balance, having time for me, having contact with recipients, if that's part of a real important part of my work in this area. And clarifying my purpose and goals in the context of my work. And then committed action, focus on what I can influence and influence it, and engage in effective work practices. So these are examples of the 2 sides of the psychological flexibility model applied to the qualitative data that the aid workers gave us. What do you think? Yes?
Sorry, I'm just aware of time. So we're a little bit over time because we kind of had a little bit of discussion before. So what do you think about, keep your questions in mind. I think some of the questions before as well that came out might be also touched on by the 2 reflection discussions, and then we can save the time at the end of all of the talks for more discussion. Is that okay with everyone? I don't want anyone to be late for drinks, that's all. Is that okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you, Ken. And Like I said, we have a handout over there that is also giving some more detail about acceptance and commitment therapy, because I know it was quite a lot to take in, and if you wanted to read more, there's some more over there, and perhaps we can show a video that we didn't have time for in the drinks. Maybe. So now we have Myrna Kassa from the War Child Lebanon team, who's going to talk about her work at War Child providing staff care.
Hello everyone. I'm going to move a bit from the research side to the more practical side of my work. I've been doing remote staff care for 3 years now. We started because of lack of access to some countries, because of the lack of mental health professionals, and the volatile security situation. It's far from ideal. I'm going to talk to you about all the challenges, but we are encouraged by the great results because at least we're doing something. So a few years ago, we decided to start working on it. I did some research and found nothing. There is no handbook. There is no resources on how to do remote staff care. Normal staff care is well researched and documented, but not the remote part. I did not want to design something from behind my desk and impose it on people. So the way I started was to design some surveys, some questionnaires, did some focus group discussions with different country offices to see what their needs are, if they would be accepting of having a counselor around, if they would be willing to talk to someone from outside, an outsider, how they usually deal with their stress, who they talk to, all of that. So, we were very pleasantly and positively surprised because people desperately wanted someone to talk to. More than 90% said that they would be willing to talk to a counselor. We did not expect those results. People asked for group work, asked for self-care trainings, asked for capacity building. So that's how we started. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the services that I provide, and as well as later as the challenges. So the first one is one-on-one counseling. Some people ask for advice one time, some people ask for more in-depth counseling. The issues that are mostly faced were mentioned by Ken. It's burnout, stress, depression, anxiety, so I'm not going to go much into detail about that. The other service that we provide is group work, self-care workshops. Based on the surveys that we did to see what they need, we would choose topics and have interactive workshops about them. All of that is mainly behind the screen. It's either on Skype, on WebEx, sometimes even on WhatsApp. Workshops would be about stress management, would be about communication skills, anything that they would ask for. It could be expressive workshops. We also provide resources for those who want. Sometimes people have an issue, but they don't want to talk to me about it, but they ask me, like, can you give me some resources about depression, please? So we can do that. I sent out a self-help brochure every month, hopefully to every one of our partners, about different topics that they would be interested in. Because a lot of people are shy or timid or are afraid to approach a counselor, so that way hopefully it would spread. We also help partners create a duty of care policy or improve theirs if they already had one. We also did a peer support training where one or more team members would be selected to receive training from us, and that they would support their peers in their country offices. So mainly, let me see if I forgot anything. So these were the main areas that we focused on. Another thing that we also did some work on was to help managers in different organizations deal with the issues they were having in the offices. For example, an entire team is suffering from motivation or is being stressed out. So instead of going to the team directly, I would work with the manager and help them help the team. So this is all ideal, but the challenges are many. All of that is done, again, behind the screen. What do you think is the biggest #1 challenge? Internet. 100%. When you're doing remote work, internet is a lifeline. When you're trying to have a call and it keeps breaking, because we're talking about countries that are conflict affected or post-conflict, internet is usually very bad. When you're trying to have a counseling conversation, a counseling session, and the internet keeps breaking every 5 seconds, or when you've planned a workshop with 25 persons and they're all waiting and there is no internet, it's really an issue. Now what we do is try to adapt as much as possible, postpone sessions, postpone workshops the same day, the next day, but unfortunately sometimes internet comes at 11 at night. That's not good for my self-care. So we cannot adapt only to a certain extent. Another issue that we face, also Ken mentioned it, is stigma around mental health. I'm not going to go much into detail, but a lot of people have ideas that mental health counseling is for the crazy, so they don't approach. And I hear it when I do team meetings that, sorry miss, we don't need your services, we're fine, we're not crazy, everything's under control. So part of my work is to also raise awareness about what staff care is, that it's more preventative than dealing with severe issues. Another challenge that we face is trust of an outsider. I'm based in Lebanon. This is the way I look, this is the way I speak. It might be sometimes very different from the people that I talk to. Not everyone is okay with that. Some people consider me an outsider because sometimes I don't speak their language, sometimes maybe because I'm not veiled. So this automatically creates, how do you say it, like a barrier, thank you. Yeah. So,
could you tell us, so you're based in Lebanon and you're bringing services to which countries, just for my
I'm working with several countries, from
within the Middle East
Europe,
region.
Africa.
So for all war child countries, you're...
Almost, not all,
okay,
but many. Yeah. So I speak English, Arabic and French, but it's not always possible to, access everyone. Yeah, so this is also a barrier. How we try to adapt is to be as empathetic as possible, to show people that we are not here to snoop into your business. I'm not a spy. I don't have a personal gain out of this. I'm really here just to support. Now another barrier in trusting an outsider is that some people don't want to give out names. They don't want to tell me their names, or they don't want to be shown on video. That's not an issue. People who do not want to show their faces can talk on audio only. And I suggest that they can give me a nickname that I can use with them without even giving me real names. Now, regarding the brochures that I told you about, I send them out. Now, how many persons actually read them? There's no way to know. It can be 5 people, it can be 500 people. That's another barrier, that's another challenge, is that I cannot know what people are doing with the information that I send out, with the brochures, with the articles, with the resources. And not being face-to-face is a big barrier. For example, if I'm doing a workshop and a person is tearing up and they leave the room, there's no way of me knowing. What we try to do to help that is make workshops with smaller groups, so I can try to recognize voices, so I can give everyone a chance to talk. so that we would be able to connect, not just give a workshop for a large number of people and then having them leave. So there is no, in many countries there are no professionals around. So I cannot do everything, I cannot help everyone. I need to refer a lot of the times, either psychiatrists, either psychologists, and in many countries there are no specialists. What we try to do as much as possible, it's not the answer, it's not the solution, is to create an environment of care among people. It's to encourage people to help each other out, to support each other, especially in places where you cannot refer, or it's very difficult to refer. Regarding the duty of care, it would be great if donors would fund it, but that's not always the case. That's not always the case. The donor community is sometimes failing their obligation to fund policies, duty of care policies. In some countries that's okay because the conflict is not very high, but in others you really do need to ensure the well-being, psychological and physical, of staff so that they would, it affects their productivity, it affects their well-being, it affects the environment at work, all of that. The last challenge, well, there are two more, is that, for example, we tried some things. We worked sometimes on trial and error. We tried the peer support program, but I can say that it wasn't very successful. In some organizations, the turnover is very high. So once in a while, I would train a team, and then they would leave. So, or sometimes the interest in supporting others when you need support yourself is also a challenge. Yeah.
About the trust issues,
Yeah.
is your department or whatever, is it part of HR or is it separate? Because I've been to...
I'm a one-man show.
You're a one-man show, in the whole of Warchild.
Yes.
So you're not part of the HR department?
I work closely with programs more than HR because my role is not for Warchild employees. It's for Warchild partners. And the final challenge I'm going to talk to you about is that sometimes top management of organizations, they either don't believe in staff care, or they don't think it's a priority, or it's a waste of time. So when they don't allow me to enter an organization, I cannot access any of the staff. So in those cases, what we try to do is not be pushy, because people will not accept it. It's to focus more on group work rather than individual work, and keep raising awareness of how this is going to increase productivity, how it's going to increase less sick leaves, how it's going to improve the atmosphere at work. So I don't impose my services on them, but I try to work on them or with them instead of the staff. How do we know that what we're working on is actually useful? We get feedback from individuals. We evaluate workshops every time we have a workshop. And once a year, at the end of every year, we do a survey where we ask people, like, do you like the services that we're providing? Do you have any other suggestions? What's working, what's not? So, although there are all of these challenges, we are sure that we're doing something positive. People are actually benefiting from them. Face-to-face staff care will always prevail. But the next best thing is to have it remotely. If you tell me to stop it because it's challenging, for me it's not an option. As long as we're doing a little bit, at least we're doing something. I hope these lessons will add and benefit your staff, your organizations, and humanitarians worldwide. And thank you for your attention.